Welcome, my fellow androids. Today we will be revealing the top 10 secrets ninja
Whoa,
players don't want you to know.
Slow down there. Sorry about that, folks. The industry has its demands, but that's not what you came here for, is it? You want to learn how to play robot. Respectable, respectable. Well, in this guide, I'm going to teach you everything you need to know about how to play robot. I will be viewing every single one of robot's moves, any character-specific mechanics, the positioning you should put yourself in and what you should do in each scenario, and how to maintain and create combos. This guide will not cover any in-depth character matchups or any universal game mechanics. So if you don't know what the health bar is, or what this bar is, or what the difference between them is, let me know in the comments and I'll maybe make a guide on that. Otherwise, if there's anything you'd like to see, put that in the comments below and let's get started. To start with, let's explain the unique UI the robot has. These three things you see right before you are the Loic charge meter, the shockwave meter, and the armor meter. The Loic charge meter is the easiest to explain. When full, you are allowed to spend super meter in order to use Loic or galvanize. It charges after 160 frames, and is simply there so robot doesn't spam Loic. Next up is armor. When toggled on, armor will negate any knockback or hit stun received from an enemy's move. This effect lasts for the entirety of your move, including attacks, movement options, and defensive options. However, when hit in this state, your actions will be delayed until the end of your opponent's attack. Armor does not apply to multi-hitting moves, like uppercut, or to grabs or moves with grab properties, like Zephyr. Once used, the armor toggle will disappear until one of two conditions is met. The first of which is to be intercepted by your own Loic or galvanized beam. The second condition is to simply hit your opponent. However, this does not apply to moves hit inside of combos. Finally, we have the shockwave indicator. After reaching a certain height, you'll see a red plus sign. This means that you've activated the shockwave threshold. Then, if you return to the ground with either a yellow move or the fall option, you will create a massive hitbox that extends the entire map. Thus, this move essentially serves as one of robot's many attacks. It has 18 frames of hit stun, and can be parried by blocking low. With that out of the way, let's look at positioning. Positioning is the spacing between you and your opponent, and can help give you an idea of what moves to use and when. If you switch your attention to the screen, you should see an overlay. This overlay represents every single one of robot's moves, and their attack range. Inside of this zone, there are three areas: close range, medium range, and long range. Close range is where most of your jabs and grabs will be. Medium range, on the other hand, is where most of your heavy attacks lie. Anything outside of those two would be considered long range. At the start of the game, both you and your opponent will be at about medium range. So, what should you do in medium range? You have three options here. The first of which is to step back. This move has basically no risk, but it has no real reward either. This move is useful if you want to scout out what move your opponent is trying to go for, or if you want your opponent to waste resources. The second and slightly more risky option is to jump in. This option has a decent reward and is generally low risk, because most of your opponent's attacks will miss if they try to hit you with it. However, if they do call out that you're jumping in, you will be heavily punished. Shown on screen now is the optimal jump heights and angles for each opposing character. These angles best avoid your opponent's attacks. For Ninja, this makes you completely immune to any attack hitting you on that turn. Therefore, it is completely safe to start off by jumping at this angle. However, both Wizard and Cowboy can still hit you if you jump at the respective angles shown on screen. For those cases, make sure you set your DI wheel to up in case you do get hit. This is a good option if you want to make progress, no matter what your opponent does. The last option you have is to attack. This is by far the most risky option, but if you do manage to attack, you'll likely get off 3,000 to 4,000 damage at minimum. This is risky, however, because every other character has an offensive option that beats your offensive option. This means it's quite likely you're going to take damage if you use the wrong move. With that being said, let's look at some of the best move options you can choose if you do want to attack. If your opponent jumps straight up, there's nothing you can do. No attack will be able to reach them that turn. Therefore, the best option you can do in that scenario is to either step forward or jump forward. If your opponent jumps a little too far forward, however, you can punish it with either optical beam or try-catch. If your opponent decides to stand still, you can use Earthquake to immediately hit them. Otherwise, Vacuum is the best option to catch opponents who try to run away. This option is best if you know what your opponent is going to do, or if you want to try to prevent your opponent from setting up in the first place. Whew, that was a lot of information. However, there's only one thing left to cover. How does armor play into all of this? It's quite simple actually. When used, armor turns any area where you would lose to an attack into a win. However, remember that certain moves are immune to the effects of armor. Still, armor is an incredibly powerful tool that can make your options in medium range incredibly safe. But let's say you slip up in medium range. Maybe you step in and you get hit back 1,000,000 miles. Right now, you're in long range. What are your options? To begin with, understand that at long range, other characters have way more options than you, so you only really have 3 options here, all of which include you getting closer to your opponent. Option 1. Car Mode. Car Mode is the most linear approach tool, which means it's very predictable. However, it is also the quickest option to get to your opponent. The only way to exit Car Mode is by either using a super, using drift, or jumping, so it can also be kind of hard to exit Car Mode once you've entered it. Option 2. Remote Bomb. By setting up a remote bomb at long distance, you can make your next approach safer. However, this also gives your opponent time to set up their own projectiles as well. Option 3. Jump. This is the mid-ground between remote bomb and drive. It is neither that fast nor that slow. However, it is safe and relatively effective. To understand which approach is best for you, consider how far away from your opponent you are and how quickly you'd like to get to them. Personally, I like jumping because it allows you to transition into your safer and generally better air options, although I think stepping is a good alternative if you want to stay grounded. But if you've managed to close the distance and you and your opponent are close enough to each other, you're going to be in close range. This is undoubtedly the most complicated part of Yomi Hustle. There are so many options that both you and your opponent can do. So let's take this slow and look at what your opponent can do when you're in close range. Perhaps the most common approach when your opponent faces you in close combat is to do some kind of defensive play. This includes options like rolling, blocking, jumping, or running away. If your opponent decides to block, which is almost always going to be block high since you have very few low attacks, you should attack with either a slow attack that will get around the block or a grab. Grabs are much safer but generally less rewarding. If your opponent recognizes that you're going for a grab or a slow attack, however, it is almost certain that they will jump to avoid both of these options. In that case, you can use Optical Beam to hit your opponent. Other attacks like Try-Catch can hit your opponent when they jump, but Optical Beam is the safest and most rewarding if you are to predict that your opponent is to jump high. If your opponent plays passively but stays on the ground, the best option is to use either Earthquake, Command Grab, or Step. Earthquake and Step have the highest reward, often leading to combos if you hit them. However, Command Grab has the highest immediate damage and can't be reacted to. If your opponent does none of the above, the last option your opponent has is to dodge. The only moves that can consistently catch dodge is Vacuum and Step, and for both you're going to need to predict the correct direction your opponent is dodging. On screen now is the image of every correct response to your opponent's action, so refer to the image if you need further help. However, your opponent can also decide to attack you. In this regard, your opponent has 3 options: either a quick attack, a slow attack, or to grab. If your opponent does a quick attack, you can't contest it, so you have, again, 3 options. The first is to block the correct direction. Most quick attacks are high attacks, so you want to block high most of the time. Option 2, roll through your opponent. If you roll away, some quick attacks and many slow attacks will still be able to hit you. Option 3, grab your opponent. Grabbing your opponent is risky because it can't be free cancelled, but it is generally safer than either blocking or rolling. Out of the 3 options, rolling is the safest, blocking is the most rewarding, and grab is somewhere in the middle. Remember though, armor will turn any attack loss into a win. Therefore, if you use armor in attack, you will win this engagement. In order to beat all 3 of those options though, your opponent can decide to use a slow attack. Slow attacks often send airborne, meaning they avoid grabs, and they're slow enough to be immune to the invincibility caused by blocking and dodging. To beat this option, simply do anything fast. This could be movement, this could be attacking, this could be doing literally nothing. It's very unlikely you're going to be hit by these attacks unless you specifically block or dodge. Otherwise, if your opponent still decides to attack, but is doing neither a slow attack nor a fast attack, that means your opponent is about to grab. Most of your grabs, however, will override the universal grab, so it's pretty safe to click most of them. Alternatively, jumping will make you unable to be grabbed by the universal grab. However, other moves with grab properties, such as Zephyr or Skull Shaker, can still grab you in the air, so keep this in mind. The last thing you're going to need to know how to do is how to combo. It's actually quite simple. If the last move's hit stun, plus the travel time, is less than the next move's startup, it will be a combo. So in this case, we can see that Earthquake has a hit stun of 6, that the travel time is 0, and that the next move, Optical Beam, has a startup of 6. Since those are equal, the combo successfully continues. If you're interested in the effective startup and hit stun for each move, check the description for a Google document, which should have all that information available. Otherwise, here are a few notable moves to use during your combos. Boot. Boot forces your opponent to bounce off the ground, so if your opponent DIs down, it's very easy for them to pop back up and for you to catch them. Kick. Kick has the highest hit stun of any of Robot's moves, so it's very easy for it to combo into anything else. However, it also does make your opponent enter the knockdown state, where only some of your moves can hit, so it can be sort of a mixed bag. Optical Beam. Optical Beam has the second highest hit stun of any of Robot's moves. It also has a very quick startup, so it's kind of combo glue, where it allows you to combo into any other move relatively safely. Earthquake. One time during a combo, Earthquake has a special grab move that combos into Remote Bomb. By setting Remote Bomb to up and slightly left, you can throw your opponent right into the bomb. But remember, it can only be used once during combos. Loic, Command Grab, Try Catch, and Bounce Check. I'm lumping all of these together because they have just about the same function. When used directly after Loic, all three of these moves will combo. However, the delay on each varies. For Try Catch and Command Grab, the ideal delay is 69. That is, unless you're using the back version of Try Catch, in which case it's 30. For Bounce Check, it varies, depending on how close you are to the wall. Usually, however, it is from somewhere from 70 to 100. Chainsaw. Chainsaw is good to catch opponents who try to DI up. Oftentimes when your opponent DIs up, you can either catch it with the fly, or by jumping. However, this isn't always the case, such as when your opponent has a high DI modifier. However, keep in mind that the hit stun for all of these moves will end early if your opponent hits the ground. So there's a high incentive for your opponent to DI down. In order to understand how some of these tools work together, let's look at a combo video that I created. Okay, that was a bit fast. Let's slow it down a bit and look at the choices I made during that replay. To start with, I open up with Step, and if you remember what I said earlier in the video, this should seem pretty familiar. At the time, I felt pretty confident my opponent was going to dash back, and as you will soon see, this immediately puts me in a good situation. My opponent, predicting here that I would either go for a defensive option or a movement option, stands still. I, on the other hand, thought my opponent would either attack or dash back again. To cover both options, I used Vacuum and Armor at the same time. Armor covered the attack, and Vacuum covered the dash back. However, because my opponent stood still, he is now in the situation where he must either correctly predict that I'm going to hold my attack and respond accordingly with a block, or that I'm going to switch up my move and predict that instead. My opponent chooses to defend, which would block the first Vacuum. However, I immediately cancel it into a second Vacuum. Since Vacuum is a slow attack, it does get around my opponent's block. After hitting with Vacuum, I plan to hit with Optical Beam because of its very long hit stun. However, I also want my opponent to DI up, because it's easier for me to combo if my opponent is in the air. In order to pressure my opponent to do this, I first set up Flamethrower on the ground so my opponent will not want to go into that area. Then I follow up with a Super Jump and a Kick. This does two things. First of all, Kick has the longest hit stun, so if my opponent DIs up, I can set up my Loic, which is almost charged. Second, if my opponent DIs down, I can use the Shockwave created from the Super Jump to hit my opponent on the ground. As you can see here, my opponent does indeed decide to DI up, but even if he were to DI down, I would have been able to catch it with the Shockwave. This right here is a great example of how to use Chainsaw. I thought my opponent was going to DI up, and I thought it would be hard to catch my opponent out if I did Optical Beam or Kick, or some other type of move. Therefore, I used Chainsaw to try to force my opponent into the corner. As you can see, I'm just using some moves to rack up the damage at this point, while keeping my opponent in the corner. Other moves like Kick, Concussive Blast, Spin Cycle, a lot of other moves would have worked in that scenario, but those are just the moves that I chose right there. Also, if you see something in this combo video that seems important, and probably is important, like the Thunderclap just now, or the upcoming Magnet, I'm not explaining those things because they get frequent changes. The Thunderclap having more hits done was changed recently, and Magnet's got a bunch of changes recently. Just know that I'm not going to address them because they're not super consistent, but generally, just so you know, you can find ways to get these moves to work together. It is at this point that my opponent becomes actionable. From here, my opponent only has two options, to either get up or roll. And as you can see, I'm trying to put my opponent in the worst state possible when he decides to either get up or roll. And if, for a second, we look back at this graph, we'll see that my opponent is unable to block and is unable to jump, which means either way, stepping is the best move in this situation. And because step beats roll, I have enough time to turn around and use command grab. Unfortunately, this does mean my Loic will miss. However, it's worth it to put my opponent back in the corner and restart the 50-50. Doesn't the scene look a little bit familiar? Let me let you in on a secret little tip. Okay, I'll stop. Stepping is actually a very good tool to put your opponent in 50-50s, where your opponent either has to predict you holding, or you stepping back, for example. Which is, exactly what I do here. Okay, that should be a brief overview of just about everything. I don't think anything here is, too in-depth, but it should be a good way for you to get started, you know? Hopefully this doesn't overload you on information. Try to end your combos at some point, and go out and do the thing. Do the thing. Thanks for watching. Everything from here on out is definitely going to be super, super, super off the cuff. So, enjoy, I guess. Or don't. This is me in post. I forgot I didn't do any of the air moves. So, if you want a guide on that, I'm not doing it. I'm not doing it. Unless. Shit.